In the year 1834, the state of Pennsylvania did something that sounds, when you first hear it, like a tall tale. They took fully loaded canal boats, the long wooden freight boats that carried passengers and cargo on the state's canals, and they hauled them up and over the top of the Allegheny Mountain. Not around it, not through a gap in it, over a summit nearly 2,300 feet above the sea, the highest point a canal boat had ever been carried anywhere on Earth. They did it on a railroad of inclined planes, 36 miles long, with 10 great slopes cut into the mountainside. The boats riding up the grades on rail cars, while stationary steam engines reeled them in on rope. And here's the part that still stops me cold. The men who designed this had been told, again and again, that it could not be done, that the mountain was simply a wall, and Pennsylvania would have to live behind it. I have been reading the old engineers' reports and the Canal Commission records, and I want to start with two real men, because they stood at the heart of this strange and brilliant machine, and one of them carried what he learned here all the way to the most famous bridge in the world. The first man is the chief engineer, Sylvester Welch. He was born in 1798, and by the time Pennsylvania handed him this problem, he was already a seasoned canal and railroad engineer, a man who had worked the waterways of the East and the new railroads pushing west. Construction began under his direction on the 21st of November, 1831, and for 3 years Welch and his crews carved a railroad into the side of a mountain that nearly everyone thought no boat could ever cross. It is his calculations, his planes, his grades, his tunnel that we are really talking about today. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. The second man came to the mountain as a young immigrant nobody had heard of, and he left it on the road to immortality. His name was John Roebling. He was born in Germany in 1806 and settled in a little Pennsylvania town called Saxonburg, and when he arrived at the Allegheny Portage Railroad, he was just a clever engineer with an idea about rope. What happened to him on this mountain, what he saw here, and what he built because of it, would lead in a straight line to the wire cables of the Brooklyn Bridge. So hold those two names, Sylvester Welch, who hauled the boats over the mountain, and John Roebling, who would change how the whole world builds because of what broke on this mountain. And remember, behind both of them stood more than 2,000 laborers, Welsh and Irish mostly, whose names the records almost never kept, the men who actually blasted and cut and built the thing. This is their story. To understand why anyone would attempt something this audacious, you have to understand that Pennsylvania was losing a race, and losing it badly. In 1825, the state of New York had finished the Erie Canal, a flat-water highway running clear across the state from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. I have told the Erie Canal story before, and it deserves every bit of its fame, but here is what it meant to Pennsylvania. New York now had a cheap, easy water route to the whole American West, and the trade of half a continent began pouring through New York City. Philadelphia, which had been the great commercial city of the early Republic, watched that business flow north to its rival, and the merchants of Pennsylvania were not willing to simply lose. They wanted their own water route to the west, their own canal to the Ohio River, and the lands beyond. There was just one problem, and it was a very large one. Between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh stood the Allegheny Mountains. It is hard to overstate how much was riding on this. For decades, Philadelphia had been the largest and richest city in the country, the place where the new nation's banks and merchants had their home. But commerce is a cold thing, and it flows wherever the cost is lowest. Once the Erie Canal opened a cheap path to the west through New York, the grain and goods of the frontier, and the manufactured goods going back the other way, increasingly moved through New York Harbor instead of Philadelphia. Pennsylvania watched its old supremacy slipping north year by year. This was not simply wounded pride. It was the economic future of the entire state, and the men who governed Pennsylvania decided they would spend almost any amount of money and attempt almost any feat of engineering rather than be locked out of the West by a wall of rock. That fear is the real engine behind everything that follows. A calmer, more comfortable state might never have tried anything this wild. Pennsylvania tried it because it felt it had no choice. A canal is the simplest idea in the world and the most unforgiving. It is a ditch full of water, and water will not run uphill. You can lift a canal boat step by step with locks, the way the Erie Canal climbed its gentler rises, but the Allegheny Ridge was not a gentle rise. It was a steep, high barrier of rock, climbing far too fast and far too high for any reasonable chain of locks. Going around it would have meant a canal hundreds of miles longer than anyone could afford. Tunneling a canal straight through the heart of the mountain was utterly beyond the engineering of the 1820s, so Pennsylvania faced what looked like a dead end. The state had authorized its Great Main Line of Public Works in 1824, a combined system of canals and railroads to link Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, but the mountain sat in the middle of that line like a locked door, and nobody had the key. It helps to picture the whole route because the portage was only one link in a remarkable chain. The main line of public works was a relay of different transports stitched end to end. A traveler leaving Philadelphia first rode a railroad west to the Susquehanna River. There they boarded a canal boat and followed the canal up the Susquehanna and the Juniata River, winding deeper into the mountains until they reached the town of Hollidaysburg at the eastern foot of the Allegheny Ridge. At Hollidaysburg, the water route simply stopped because the mountain began. The boat was lifted onto the Portage Railroad and carried over the summit to Johnstown on the western side. At Johnstown, it slid back into the water onto the Western Canal and floated down toward Pittsburgh and the Ohio River. Railroad, then canal, then mountain railroad, then canal again. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was the single hardest link in that chain, the one piece that made the whole improbable system work. Without it, the rest of the main line would have run up to the foot of a mountain and stopped dead, and the clock was running the whole time. Every year that Pennsylvania spent arguing and surveying was another year of Western trade lost to New York, so the state did not wait for some perfect, gentler answer that might never come. It committed to the boldest plan on the table, a railroad that would carry boats bodily over the mountain, and it handed the hardest part of it to Sylvester Welch and told him to make it work. The pressure to simply get it built, and built fast, runs through this entire project like a current. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now, back to it. The answer the engineers finally landed on was so bold that it still feels a little insane. If the boats cannot float over the mountain, and they cannot go around it or through it, then you lift the boats out of the water entirely, set them on wheels, and carry them bodily over the top. You build a railroad across the mountain, and the railroad's cargo is the canal boats themselves. The water route would simply pause at the foot of the mountain. The boat would climb the ridge on rails, and on the far side it would slide back into the canal and float on as if nothing had happened. This was the Allegheny Portage Railroad. And when you stop and picture it, a loaded freight boat creeping up the face of a mountain on a rail car, it is one of the strangest sights in the history of American transportation. At each end of the mountain crossing sat a busy transfer basin, one at Hollidaysburg on the east and one at Johnstown on the west, and these were scenes of constant motion. Boats came up the canal and were eased onto the rail cars. Sections were unbolted and sorted. Cargo was checked, mules were hitched, and the whole noisy business of moving freight between water and rail went on day and night in season. A town grew up around each basin to feed and house and serve the traffic, and the men who worked these transfer points, the boat handlers, the hitchers, the mule drivers, the engine tenders, were a small army in themselves. The mountain crossing was not one machine, but a whole choreography of men and animals and engines, all of it timed to keep the boats moving up one side of the ridge and down the other without a jam. When it ran well, it ran like a strange clock. When it did not, boats and cargo backed up at the foot of the plains and tempers ran as hot as the boilers. Here's how the thing actually worked. The 36-mile railroad was not one smooth climb. It was built as a series of stretches, 11 fairly level grades where the cars could be pulled along almost like an ordinary railroad, connected by 10 steep inclined planes, 5 climbing up the eastern side of the ridge and 5 descending the western side. On the level grades, the work was done by mules. Teams of mules pulled little trains of 2 or 3 cars along the flatter sections, plodding the boats and their cargo across the gentler ground between the steep slopes. But the plains were a different matter entirely. A plain was a long, straight ramp cut up the mountainside, some of them steep enough to make you dizzy, and no mule on earth could pull a loaded canal boat up a grade like that. So at the top of each plain, the engineers built an engine house, a stone building containing a powerful stationary steam engine. That engine turned a great drum, and around the drum ran a long rope that stretched all the way down the plain. A car coming up was hooked to the rope and reeled in by the engine, while a car going down on a parallel track helped counterbalance it. The boats did not climb the mountain. They were pulled up it, one plane at a time, by stationary engines that never moved an inch. Let me put you on one of the planes, because the operation of them was a marvel of nerve as much as engineering. At the head of each plane stood the engine house, and inside it, a stationary steam engine turned a huge iron drum. Around that drum ran the long haulage rope, stretching all the way down the slope. The system was built to balance itself. As one car was hauled up the plane, a second car was let down the parallel track at the same time, the descending weight helping to offset the climbing load, so the engine did not have to lift the full weight alone. Signals had to pass between the top and the bottom of each plane so the engineman knew when to take up the rope and when to ease it off, and the timing had to be exact. A canal boat full of cargo, sitting high on a rail car, was an enormous and awkward thing to drag up a 10% grade, and everyone working the plane knew what was hanging over them, quite literally. If anything let go, because when something did let go, there was very little anyone could do. A car breaking loose near the top of a plane would come down the mountain gathering speed, and the men below had seconds to get clear. The line developed safety devices to try to catch a runaway, hitches and stops meant to grab a car if the rope failed. But no device was perfect, and the steep plains of the Allegheny Portage Railroad killed and maimed men across the years it ran. This was dangerous work performed in the open weather on the side of a mountain, with steam and iron and rope under tremendous strain. And the men who tended the engines and hitched the cars and rowed the boats up, the planes were trusting their lives to ropes and signals every single day. The wonder is not that there were accidents. The wonder is that the thing worked at all, day after day, for 20 years. For all that danger, the planes had a strange grace to them when they worked. A traveler standing at the bottom could watch a loaded boat rise smoothly up the mountainside on its rope, pause at the engine house at the top, and then move on toward the next grade. The whole operation quiet except for the hiss of the steam engine and the creak of the rope. It looked, by some accounts, almost effortless, which was the highest compliment you could pay to a machine that was anything but. And the men who ran it made that hard and deadly thing look easy, every single working day. Then I tell you what happened next, but first do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories like this one, unless enough people click. One click. Come back. The numbers on those planes are worth sitting with, because they tell you how steep this really was. The summit of the line stood close to 2,300 feet above sea level, and the eastern side, climbing up from Hollidaysburg, rose about 1,400 feet in just the first 10 miles. The 10 planes ran at grades from around 7.5% up to nearly 10%, which does not sound like much until you realize that almost no railroad in the world is built to climb anything close to that. Plane number 8, the longest and steepest of them all, ran more than 3,000 feet up the slope at a grade near 10%. Imagine standing at the bottom of that and watching a loaded canal boat, sitting on a rail car, being dragged straight up the mountainside above you on a single rope, with another car sliding down the next track to balance it. Imagine the strain on that rope. Hold that thought, because the rope is where this story turns. There was one more piece of cleverness that made the whole thing possible, and it solved a very practical problem. A canal boat is long, much longer than any rail car of the day, and dragging a single long rigid hull up a steep, curving mountain plane would have been a nightmare. So the boat builders came up with the sectional canal boat. These were boats built in 2, 3, or 4 separate sections that could be unbolted and taken apart. When a boat reached the foot of the mountain, it was split into its sections. Each section was loaded onto its own rail car. The sections were hauled separately up and over the ridge, and on the far side, they were floated and bolted back together into a whole boat again, ready to continue down the canal. A traveler could, in theory, stay aboard their section the entire time, riding over the top of the Allegheny Mountain in a piece of a boat. That is very nearly what the novelist Charles Dickens did, and we will come back to him. It is worth remembering what was actually riding in those boats, because the portage was not built as a curiosity. It was built to move the real traffic of a growing country. The boats carried freight of every kind, iron and coal and manufactured goods heading west, grain and flour, and the produce of the frontier heading east. And they carried people, a great many of them immigrants and settlers bound for the western lands, Families with everything they owned packed into a section of a canal boat, riding up and over the Allegheny Mountain on their way to a new life in Ohio or Indiana or beyond. For a poor family from Europe who had crossed an ocean and then crossed Pennsylvania, the climb over the portage must have been the most astonishing thing they had ever seen. Their whole boat lifted out of the water and dragged up a mountain on ropes. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was not a museum piece in its day. It was a working artery, carrying the commerce and the hopes of a nation through the one gap the mountains had refused to give up easily. By the 1840s, the line was carrying a steady stream of this traffic, boat after boat going up and over the ridge through the whole working season. It was never fast by our standards, and it was never cheap to run, with all those engines burning fuel and all those men and mules to pay. But measured against the only alternative, dragging everything over the mountains by wagon, it was a revolution. And for 2 decades, it was simply how the commerce of Pennsylvania crossed the Alleghenies. The boats kept climbing, and at the head of every plane, a single rope kept the whole thing from disaster. Which brings us, at last, to the ropes. Now, about that rope. Because this is where the Allegheny Portage Railroad quietly changed the world. In the early years, the ropes that hauled the cars up the plains were made of hemp, great thick ropes about 9 inches around. Hemp rope is strong, but it wears, it frays, it rots, and under the enormous strain of dragging loaded cars up a mountain, it had to be replaced constantly. And worse, it could fail without warning. When one of those ropes broke with a car on the plain, the result was a runaway. A car and its load tearing back down the mountain with nothing to stop it. The records and the traditions of the line remember exactly that kind of horror. John Roebling, the young German engineer at Saxonburg, is said to have watched a canal boat go careening down a mountain plain after a hemp rope let go, and 2 men were killed. And Roebling, who had been turning over an idea in his head, decided the time had come to build it. His idea was to make rope not out of plant fiber but out of iron wire, many thin wires twisted together into a cable far stronger and far more durable than hemp could ever be. He went back to Saxonburg and laid out a rope walk, a long straight stretch of ground on his own land, and there he twisted the first of his 7-strand iron wire cables by hand. In March of 1842, the canal commissioners contracted with Roebling to supply wire rope for plane number 3 of the Portage Railroad near Johnstown. And that summer, the first of his wire rope went onto the mountain. That same year, on the 16th of July, 1842, Roebling received his first United States patent, number 2720, for his method and machine for making wire rope. Think carefully about what just happened on this mountain. The wire cable, the single invention that would later make the great suspension bridges possible. The cables that hang the Brooklyn Bridge over the East River to this day was first proven hauling canal boats up the side of the Allegheny Mountain. Roebling went from these inclined planes to building the most famous bridge in America. It all started here, with a broken hemp rope and 2 dead men and a young immigrant who thought there had to be a better way. One quick note, I turned the full story of the Allegheny Portage Railroad into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. I have spent all this time on the engines and the ropes and the planes, and I have to stop now and talk about the men who actually built this, because the machine did not build itself. More than 2,000 laborers worked on the Allegheny Portage Railroad over its 3 years of construction, and the heaviest, most dangerous work fell on Welsh miners and Irish laborers, the same kind of immigrant labor force that had dug the Erie Canal a decade before. Their hardest single task was the tunnel. To carry the railroad through one shoulder of the mountain, the engineers had to drive a tunnel about 900 feet long straight through solid rock. They called it the Staple Bend Tunnel, and when it was finished, it was the first railroad tunnel in the United States of America. There were no power tools. The men cut that tunnel by hand, drilling holes into the rock face with hammers and hand drills, packing the holes with black powder, blasting a few feet at a time, and hauling out the broken stone, working in from both ends of the mountain and hoping their 2 bores would meet in the middle. It took years. An assistant engineer named Solomon Roberts oversaw the work. The Welsh and the Irish supplied the muscle, the lungs, and the lives. And when the 2 ends finally met inside the mountain, and the first railroad tunnel in the country stood open, almost none of the men who had blasted it got their names written down anywhere. The building of that tunnel deserves a moment of its own. The men worked in from both ends of the ridge at once, boring 2 headings toward each other through solid rock, trusting the engineers' surveys that the two bores would meet somewhere in the dark heart of the mountain. They drilled the rock by hand, one man holding and turning the steel while another swung the hammer, then packed the holes with black powder and blasted, then cleared the shattered stone and started again. A few feet a day, for years. The eastern portal was finished with cut and dressed stone, a piece of real craftsmanship on a structure most travelers would pass through in a matter of moments. When the two headings finally met, and the first railroad tunnel in the United States stood open through the mountain, it was a milestone in American engineering, and it had been driven by the lungs and the arms of immigrant laborers whose individual names almost none of us will ever know. The tunnel was only one piece of it. The same hands built 4 great stone viaducts to carry the line over the valleys, more than 70 stone culverts to handle the mountain streams, and the 10 massive stone engine houses that held the steam engines at the heads of the plains. Every stone was cut and set by hand. Every cut through the rock was made with powder and muscle. This was not a quick or a cheap thing. It was 3 years of brutal labor on the side of a mountain, in the heat and the cold, with black powder and hand tools, by men who were paid a daily wage and remembered as a number. They built something that had never existed anywhere in the world, a working railroad that carried boats over a mountain, and they finished it in 1834. When it opened, it changed the country's sense of distance almost overnight. Before the main line of public works, getting from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh meant a long, jolting, exhausting wagon journey over the mountains that could take the better part of 3 weeks. With the canals and the portage railroad working together, that same trip dropped to about 4 days. 4 days, from the Atlantic coast to the gateway of the West, on water and over a mountain. Goods that had been impossibly expensive to haul over the Alleghenies could now move at a fraction of the cost. Passengers who would never have attempted the mountain crossing now rode it in relative comfort. For about 20 years, this strange hybrid of canal and railroad was one of the great engineering wonders of America, and people came from all over to see it. One of those people was the English novelist Charles Dickens, who was already world famous when he toured the United States in 1842. Dickens rode the Allegheny Portage Railroad and wrote about it in his travel book, American Notes, and he described the experience of being carried over the mountain with the wonder of a man who could hardly believe what he was seeing. Picture it through his eyes. You are sitting in a boat. The boat is on a rail car. The rail car is being hauled up the face of a mountain by a rope you cannot see the end of, and below you the valley falls away while the ridges of Pennsylvania roll out toward the horizon. Then you crest the summit, the highest a canal boat has ever been, and you begin the long, controlled descent down the western plains toward Johnstown and the waiting canal, and the rivers that run to the Ohio and the Mississippi and the heart of the continent. A traveler in the 1840s had never seen anything like it, because there was nothing else like it anywhere on Earth. And yet, here is the hard turn this story takes, the same turn so many of these stories take. The Allegheny Portage Railroad was a brilliant solution to a problem, but it was also slow and clumsy in its way. Splitting boats into sections, hauling them up 10 separate planes, transferring them between water and rail and water again, all of it took time and labor and money. It was a marvel, but it was a marvel built right at the edge of one technology, giving way to another. Because even as the boats were creeping up the plains, the railroad itself, the real railroad, the continuous line of track with a locomotive that never stopped, was coming of age. And the same mountain that had forced Pennsylvania to invent the portage was about to be conquered a different way. In the 1850s, the Pennsylvania Railroad pushed a continuous line of track up and over the Allegheny Mountain, curving around the famous horseshoe curve to ease the grade, with locomotives that could pull a train straight over the ridge without ever splitting a boat or hooking it to a rope. A train could now do, in hours, without transfer, what the portage did in a long day of planes and ropes and mules. The contest was over almost before it began. The Allegheny Portage Railroad, which had opened in 1834 as a wonder of the world, closed in 1854 after just 20 years, and the Pennsylvania Railroad bought the line in 1857. The boats stopped climbing the mountain. The great engines in the stone houses went silent. The plains grew over. In the span of a single working life, the Portage Railroad was born, astonished the world, and was made obsolete by the very kind of railroad it had helped pioneer. The state itself could see the plains were becoming a liability, and in the early 1850s it tried to fix them. Pennsylvania built what was called the New Portage Railroad, a rebuilt line that did away with most of the inclined planes in favor of a grade a locomotive could run. But it was too little and far too late. By the time the new line was ready, the Pennsylvania Railroad's own route over the mountain was already taking the traffic, and the state's whole costly main line of public works had become an aging relic. In the end, Pennsylvania sold the entire system, canals, planes, tunnel, and all, to the Pennsylvania Railroad. The state that had spent a fortune to carry boats over a mountain handed the whole thing to the company whose locomotives had made carrying boats unnecessary. There is a hard lesson buried in that, about being first, and about how the boldest solution of one decade can become the abandoned curiosity of the next. But nothing about it was wasted, and that is the part I want to leave you with. The wire rope that John Roebling first proved on these planes went on to hang the Brooklyn Bridge and to make the modern suspension bridge possible all over the world. The engineering lessons learned hauling boats over the Alleghenies fed directly into the railroads that would soon cross the whole continent. The Staple Bend Tunnel, the first railroad tunnel in America, proved that men with hand drills and black powder could drive a railroad straight through a mountain, a lesson the transcontinental railroads would lean on a generation later. And the Allegheny Portage Railroad itself was not entirely lost. It survives today as a National Historic Site, the old tunnel still standing, the engine house foundations still on the ridge, the line honored as a National Historic Civil Engineering landmark. You can still walk the grade where the boats once climbed and stand at the summit where they crossed the top. Here is the thought I will leave you with, and you can tell me in the comments whether you think I have it right. We remember the Erie Canal because it was the simple, elegant solution, the flat water route that worked. We tend to forget the Allegheny Portage Railroad because it was the awkward one, the strange contraption that hauled boats over a mountain and then got replaced in 20 years. But I think the harder, stranger solution deserves more honor, not less. New York had the luck of a low, flat route across its state. Pennsylvania had a mountain in the way, and rather than give up the West, the engineers and the Welsh miners and the Irish laborers chose to carry the boats over the top by hand, and in doing so, they invented or proved half a dozen things, including the wire rope that still holds up the Brooklyn Bridge. Sometimes the country that gets handed the harder problem ends up building the more important thing. The men who hauled canal boats over a mountain were beaten by the locomotive in the end, but the locomotive learned half of what it knew from them. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.